The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, here we are another year, another Labor budget. And I've got to say that from my perspective, it's just been another example of more of the same. Unfortunately, we know that when it comes to Labor Party budgets, it's a case of look at what Labor does, not look at what Labor says it's going to do. And who would forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it wasn't that long ago that Kevin Rudd was elected at the end of the Coalition's period in office in 2007, promising to be a fiscal conservative. The Labor Party held themselves out to the electorate and said, we learned the lessons of the past. The Labor Party is not going to be a tax and spend government anymore. You can trust us to steer the Australian economy. You can trust the Labor Party to deliver surpluses and to make the big calls correctly to ensure ongoing prosperity for the Australian people. And here we are, Madam Deputy Speaker, 6 years later, and what do we know? We know the track record of the Australian Labor Party, true to form, has been a continuation of the exact same profligacy that we saw when Labor was last in office. We've seen the Labor Party engage in a process of taxing and spending. We saw the hard work of the coalition that for 12 years committed itself to making the tough calls, committed itself to saying no to people when we had to say no because we knew it wasn't in Australia's long-term financial interests, and also providing tax relief where we could afford to do so. After a period of abolishing wholesale sales tax and introducing the GST to make sure Australia was on a sustainable fiscal platform, the Coalition saw the economic opportunity squandered. Now, for the Labor Party, when they were elected in 2007, a matter of about 6 months later, they delivered, and I guess use the word delivered in quotations, Madam Deputy Speaker, they delivered a budget surplus of around $20 to $22 billion from memory, built off the back of the hard work and the decisions that have been taken by the Coalition in, at the very least, the 12 months prior, but perhaps more accurately, over the 12 years prior. And then we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Labor Party got a firm grip on the levers controlling the Australian economy and on making the decisions about what they believed to be the priorities for our nation. And lo and behold, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we saw was the massive erosion of Australia's competitive standing and of Australia's fiscal position. Over the past 6 years of Labor Party government, over the past 6 years of Labor Party incumbency, we've seen Australia's financial position move from being $70 billion worth of assets, the Future Fund, the Higher Education Fund, Medicare Fund, $20 billion plus surpluses, to deficits of $44 billion, $58 billion, and of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, who could forget this year, a guaranteed, you can bet your life on it, surplus by the Labor Party of $1 billion, which has turned out to be a $19.4 billion deficit. And what's more, Madam Deputy Speaker, after the Treasurer stood up in the budget speech last year and said, this is the first surplus with years of surplus to follow, we now find that, oops, typical Labor, $19.4 billion deficit, an $18 billion deficit over the next financial year that's been budgeted, followed by, I think, a $17 billion deficit the year after that. Now, the Labor Party, of course, again, true to form, says, but this isn't our fault. It's all a consequence of international circumstances. If only we hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time, we could have governed effectively and we could have made sure the Australian people weren't up to their eyeballs in debt. If only it wasn't for the GFC, the Labor Party would have continued making the big calls right, and we would have seen the Australian people continue to enjoy strong economic growth. If only the Labor Party hadn't been the victims of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, then they wouldn't have allowed a situation to arise where Australia moved from $70 billion of net assets to now gross debt approaching $400 billion in 6 years. The problem with that approach, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it's just not supported by the facts, though. Because the inescapable facts about Australia's economic performance are this. Granted, the GFC has been particularly pronounced in Europe. We see fiscal problems of a magnitude not seen since the Great Depression throughout Europe. But that is not the story in our part of the world. That is not the story with respect to our major trading partners. That's not the story with respect to the United States. The simple reality is that in our region, the countries with whom Australia does the bulk of its trade, the countries with whom we export to, there has been, yes, significant economic tumult about 3 to 5 years ago, but since then a sustained pathway of strong economic growth. China has seen growth remain above 7% for years. The United States is seeing a strong economic recovery that's really taken hold most recently. And of course we see throughout the bulk of our Asian neighbours continued and ongoing economic resilience and strength. And when you look at the economic profile of other countries, Madam Deputy Speaker, such as, for example, Canada, or other like mid-range economies similar to Australia, Madam Deputy Speaker, the story could not be more different to the Australian experience. In those countries, they're once again back into positions of surplus. They're once again paying down debt. They're once again provisioning for the future. And it stands in remarkable and stark contrast to the Labor Party, which continue to say, it's not us, it's everybody else that's the problem. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents on the Gold Coast know what the problem is. They know the problem is that this is a Labor government that, true to form, is big taxing and big spending. There's never been a spending initiative that the Labor Party doesn't like, Madam Deputy Speaker, and there's never been a tax the Labor Party doesn't like either. And what constituents talk to me about on a regular basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, is their sense of betrayal by this Labor Prime Minister, who we all know stabbed in the back the former Labor Prime Minister and said, I was forced to do it because we were making some major policy errors. The mining tax, border protection, to name the two that spring immediately to mind. These were issues that needed to be addressed. That was the excuse afforded by the current Labor Prime Minister to stab in the back Kevin Rudd, the member for Griffith and Australia's elected Prime Minister prior to that. And what do we discover? We discover that this Labor Party, the Prime Minister who only 6 days out from the last federal election looked down the barrel of TV cameras and said there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, the current Treasurer who said claims that at that stage the coalition was making that Labor had plans to introduce a carbon tax were, to quote the Treasurer, hysterical. And what has come to pass? We now know that in fact those claims weren't hysterical, they're exceptionally accurate. And the Prime Minister who said there'll be no carbon tax under the government I lead introduced a carbon tax. And the Prime Minister who said I had to stab the member for Griffith in the back because we got it wrong on border protection has now seen effectively an armada of boats coming not only to the islands around Australia, but to Australia's very mainland, with about 40,000 asylum seekers coming to Australia since Labor changed the laws. And it's the falseness, Madam Deputy Speaker, with which Labor goes about its budget process that concerns me as well. Because we know that the Labor Party needs to fudge the figures, frankly, when it comes to trying to make out that they've got everything under control when it comes to the nation's finances. And that's the reason why, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've seen the Labor Party claim, for example, that the costs of border protection were going to reduce. So at the very time when we're getting record numbers of asylum seekers coming to Australia because our borders are effectively non-existent, we have a situation where the Labor Party says, oh no, sure, there's been a $6.5 billion blowout when it comes to the costs of dealing with the problem that we created when we change the laws. But you know what? Trust us, in the next 12 months, the costs are going to go down. It's all right, we've got it under control. No change to policy, and lo and behold, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we saw was that the costs went up, just as the Coalition predicted they would. Likewise, Madam Deputy Speaker, when the Coalition effectively openly laughed at Labor's projected $1 billion surplus, and then this year the Treasurer says, well, these events were unpredictable. How were we to know we'd have revenue write-downs of the magnitude that we've had? Playing the victim card once again, we saw from the Labor Party. But the problem was, Madam Deputy Speaker, that after the budget last year, the Shadow Treasurer, the member for North Sydney, in his address to the National Press Club, stated that we simply could not rely on Labor's forecasts because they were built off an expected increase in revenue of $39 billion. And the Shadow Treasurer mocked the fact that Labor said there would be a miraculous $39 billion recovery in revenue, and that is what would deliver a $1 billion surplus this year. And lo and behold, he was right. There was no miraculous $39 billion recovery. It was all just spin put in place by the Labor Party to attempt to hoodwink the Australian people. Well, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my electorate of the Gold Coast, people are sick and tired of this Labor government. They don't believe a word that comes from the lips of the Prime Minister. They certainly don't believe the fiscal strategy of this Labor Party because it is bereft of any relevance and it is absolutely bereft of any credibility, Madam Deputy Speaker. Australians are ready to say to this government, we reject you and we reject the approach of the Labor Party. They reject 40 new or increased taxes since Labor were elected. They reject the world's biggest carbon tax. They reject a mining tax that raises $125 million when once again Labor projects that it was actually going to raise over $2 billion. Australians are not mugs, Madam Deputy Speaker. They recognise a foul stench when they smell one, and they know that this government has a foul stench about it. And for that reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am certainly pleased to be part of a coalition that has a proud track record of delivering not only for the people of Australia, but for my city of the Gold Coast. Local media and constituents were concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in this year's budget papers there was one solitary mention of the Gold Coast, Australia's sixth largest city, in the budget papers. Some 4,800 pages of documents with one solitary mention. And I'm not surprised, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the Labor Party has not been seen anywhere near the Gold Coast for years. The Prime Minister has physically set foot in the city twice over the last term, both times to address the AWU conference, cloistered within the walls and confines of an AWU conference. But the reality is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Labor Party has no form when it comes to understanding the Gold Coast. The Labor Party doesn't understand the Gold Coast because fundamentally, if there is one trait that is consistent across the city with all of my constituents, it's a belief in small business and entrepreneurship. And the reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that is foreign to Labor. It's foreign to Labor because it's not about unionised workforces, it's not about their approach to industrial relations, it's not about Labor's tax and spend approach to how they run government, and that's the reason why the Labor Party has been missing in action on the Gold Coast for years. Well, I recommit myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, and say to all Gold Coasters that tomorrow can be better than today. The Coalition has positive plans that we will put in place to get Australia back on track. The Coalition has in place a strong track record that demonstrates not only that we are committed to getting our economy back on track, but also that we are committed to tourism and construction industries, the two single biggest employers across the city. We get small business. We get tourism. We get the construction and property industries, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's the reason why we delivered historically. That's the reason why the Coalition got unemployment down to a record low, the lowest in 33 years. And that's the reason why, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will resolve to recommit ourselves to paying off the nearly $400 billion of debt that Labor's racked up and getting Australia's economy back on track, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the next generation of Gold Coasters deserve it.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.